Alright, so I've set up the board and I'm just about ready to begin the Turning the Tide 3rd and 4th day scenario of Red Winter. Setup took a bit longer than expected. Well, not terribly long, just longer than usual for me. I'm still getting used to the fact that you can spend quite a bit of time just setting up a game and that it can be a pretty big part of the gameplay experience. Especially so for me with this scenario because of all the flexibility given to the players, all the options involved as to where they'd like to begin each specific unit in a given region. So it began by roughly gauging the boundaries of each of the players' positions and then slowly narrowing down my choices by shifting counters around until I was able to satisfy all of the criteria. Some of those criteria are overlapping, but I believe that the way I've set up is correct. And if not optimal, at least it makes sense to me, so I'm going to stick with what I have and fight the urge to continue shuffling pieces around. So the plan is to take a look at my setup in detail, to also take a look at the special rules and victory conditions for this scenario, and in no specific order, to do a brief rules overview that may hopefully be of interest to those of you who are new to the game or unfamiliar with the system, but more importantly for my own purposes. I can never have too many rules refreshers. So apologies in advance for any mispronunciation as usual. I know that I am about to unintentionally embarrass myself with these place names. I also wanted to show you this book that I picked up recently on the topic, A Frozen Hell, the Russo-Finnish Winter War of 1939-40 by William R. Trotter, published in 2000 by Algonquin Paperbacks. As I didn't have any reading material on the topic, this covers the entirety of the Winter War. In it, there's a chapter though, chapter 9 I think, that deals specifically with the topic of this game, the Soviet attack at Tolvayarvi, and it's a brief but very engaging chapter that describes some of the major events that occurred in context of the entirety of the war, but it describes that first night raid, that Finnish night raid across Lake Tolvayarvi past Kotasari, led by Pajari, a bit about his heart condition, how that affected him on the way back that night, the Soviet raid on the Finnish field kitchen up north here, as well as, of course, the events in and around Hirvashayu Hotel and the gravel pits outside, among other stories. So I could recommend the book for people who, like me, are not very familiar with the topic and looking for something that mentions, at least in context of the entire war, where the subject matter of this game will kind of fits. It may not be as detailed as the historical notes and designer notes in the playbook, but it's actually very interesting to read. Good kind of auxiliary reading material. Alright, taking a look at the rules, I'll just flip through the book as we go along. It's probably a good idea. I'll try to keep it brief. Starting with scale, each game turn represents about 90 minutes of real time. Each night turn, however, represents about 15 hours. And there's a whole section at the back of the book, 2 pages dedicated to rules specific to the night turns, describing actions that can only be taken during those turns, like building bonfires as the Soviets, conducting night raids as the Finns. It affects movement differently because of the longer passage of time that it represents, and there's a whole sub-zero loss phase at the end. And we only have one night turn in our scenario here, and I'll probably get into these in more detail then. Just turn 19, the 7th turn. It's pretty common that in the shorter scenarios you'll only have one night turn, and even in the entire campaign of 32 turns, only 4 of those turns represent night turns. So it doesn't make up a big portion of the gameplay, but it is what I think makes this game unique, exciting, a little bit more unpredictable. I've never played as the Finns, so I don't really have a good grasp on how to most effectively use those turns to my advantage as the Finns, but as a Soviet player, I usually only focus on it during maybe the turn or two preceding it. There have been night turns where very little has happened, others where it's really dictated the winner of the scenario. We'll see what happens during my playthrough. Going back to scale, each hex is roughly 425 yards across, and units represent mostly companies, which would make this game, I think, grand tactical in scale. There are other units like these red off-map Soviet artillery units that represent battalions, and then there's a Finnish engineer platoon. Let's take a look at those counters in detail. Here's a Finnish infantry company with its historical designation here on the left. So it's the 8th company of the 3rd Battalion of the 37th Regiment or something. The number here on the left is the unit's combat strength. On the right we have its movement allowance. In the center is its ranged attack strength, with the superscript showing its range and number of hexes. Line of sight is changes from turn to turn and it's shown on the turn track, and it's dependent on the amount of daylight available, and can range from 1 hex during night turns to 5 hexes during day turns. These infantry companies can come in different flavors. Here's the Finnish bicycle company. That pretty much acts just like an infantry company, except it has this cool bicycle icon and circular NATO symbol. We also have machine gun units. Here's a Soviet machine gun unit. Its combat strength is in this black box, meaning that it's doubled on defense. And these are all 2-step units. We have mortars, and its combat strength is in parentheses, meaning that it can only contribute that strength when defending. Its ranged attack strength is in this yellow box, meaning that it utilizes indirect ranged attacks and requires a spotter. It can be self-spotting, just like these infantry guns. And once fired, they're flipped and cannot be used again until the owning player's reset phase. We have also these off-map artillery units. Here's a Finnish artillery unit, a Soviet artillery unit, also flipped when fired. They don't enter the map, so they don't have a combat strength or movement allowance. They have an infinite range, however, and as long as they have a spotter with line of sight to a target, can fire anywhere upon the map. Once they're fired, they're flipped. And for each such unit that's fired, the player must also spend a point of ammo. There are some other types of units, AT guns, engineer platoons, Payari, who doesn't have a combat strength, does have a movement allowance, and provides all sorts of benefits to the player as modifiers on these tables that I'll show you in a moment on these player aids. Here is the map key showing the different types of terrain and the movement cost associated with entering these types of terrain. We have forest, suo or wetland, village, frozen lake. Here's a reminder that all Finnish units except AT guns pay only 1 movement point instead of 1.5 when entering a frozen lake hex due to their ski bonus. There are 3 different types of road: main road, primary road, and secondary road, that I think only matter when dealing with Soviet armored units movement, which I have yet to actually deal with, and I don't think they come into play during our scenario. So they all cost half a movement point to move along. and that's regardless of terrain. There's extended road movement in this game, which means you get +2 movement points if your entire movement is along a road and 4 or more hexes away from all enemy units. There are bridges and supply sources that affect combat and supply line tracing and determining victory. Enemy zones of control are rigid, inactive, and suppressive in terms of supply tracing. So you must stop upon entering an enemy zone of control. You're not obligated to attack any enemies during your combat phase whose zones of control you occupy. And you can trace supply through friendly units that occupy an enemy zone of control. And the stacking limit is 5 units per hex. No more than 3 of those can be infantry companies. So you can have, for example, a full battalion, 3 infantry companies and a machine gun unit, plus 1 other unit that's not an infantry company in the same hex. And these are enforced at the end of movement and at the beginning of any assault. Supply is traced only at very specific moments during the game, when receiving replacements, when attempting recovery, when determining victory and how many points each player receives at the end of the game, and when a unit is eliminated. If an infantry company is in supply at the moment it's eliminated, it is brought to this eligible for reconstitution Deadpool box. Otherwise, if it's out of supply when eliminated, and all other eliminated units are placed in this permanently eliminated Deadpool. And you may receive a certain number of replacement points on a given turn, and that's all noted on the turn track. You can spend those to reconstitute infantry companies or to rebuild reduced strength infantry companies on the board. You also receive from turn to turn a varying number of ammo. So each player in this scenario starts with 1 point of ammo, but for example in the first turn the Soviets receive 10 and the Finns receive 4. Let's take a look at the sequence of play. So the first thing that happens is the first player reset phase, during which the phasing player flips over any previously fired mortars, infantry guns, and artillery to show that they're available again during the upcoming combat phase. And then if any ammo is received this turn, we record that on the information track by moving the corresponding marker. And then if any replacement points are received, those can be spent to reconstitute previously eliminated infantry companies or to rebuild reduced infantry companies. And those points must be spent or lost during this reset phase. Then we enter the action phase, and during this phase each unit may perform one of a few possible actions. Move and or assault, attempt recovery, dig in, or do nothing. Assault is a special type of combat that I actually have never seen in action, probably because there's a high risk associated with it along with a high movement cost. Basically, units that are assaulting have to be able to pay the movement cost to enter the target hex terrain along with 2 additional movement points, and then suffer all losses as step reductions and must advance after combat if eligible. So if anyone's going to be assaulting, it's more likely to be the Finnish player after a change of operational stance is declared, which I'll talk about when we look at the special rules for the scenario. Because on top of that, they get a Finnish submachine gun bonus, as long as it's not on a frozen lake hex, I believe. And generally speaking, their units have a higher movement allowance. Attempting recovery can be done by reduced infantry companies, by rolling a d6 on the recovery table over here, and applying any modifiers, and hoping for a result of 6 or more. Digging in is, generally speaking, a two-step, two-turn process. First, you would place a digging in counter on the unit, and then during the following turn, when that unit digs in again, you flip the counter over to show that it's dug in, and that provides a one left column shift when defending. Engineer platoons can dig in completely during a single turn, even when they're in an enemy zone of control. Otherwise, units can only dig in when they're not in an enemy zone of control. Night turns are special, and units can dig in during a single turn if it's a night turn, even if they're in an enemy zone of control as well. And then there's some other special actions that can be performed during the night turns, as mentioned before. And then we enter the combat phase. Here's the combat results table, resolved using 2d6. The ratios are 1 to something or something to 1, ranging from 1 to 4 to 6 to 1. The number to the left of the slasher are losses applied to the attacker, the number to the right, losses inflicted upon the defender. The attacker must always suffer the first loss as a step reduction. Otherwise, they can be applied as a combination of step reductions and or retreat hexes. Step reductions must be applied first, and the maximum number of hexes a unit can retreat through is equal to their movement allowance minus 2. Same goes for multi-hex advances. If a unit or stack must retreat through an enemy zone of control, that unit or stack must suffer a step reduction that does not go towards satisfying their losses. If a unit conducts a multi-hex advance after combat, it must stop upon entering the first enemy zone of control. When resolving combat against a hex, we first declare the hex we're attacking and with which unit or units we're attacking it with, and then declare any offensive support we wish to commit. Then the non-phasing player declares any defensive support. I'm going to skip the part about Soviet armored units and anti-tank fire. Then we resolve the declared support by rolling on the rat on the ranged attack table to see if we have any suppressed results or suppressed and step reductions. And then we figure out our final table here on the CRT and apply any modifiers and roll and apply the results. Attackers may advance after combat. Here's a quick look at the combat result table modifiers. These apply to combats, assaults, and Finnish night raids, as noted here along the left-hand side. The first two apply to all, 3 and 4 apply to combats only. Then we have modifiers that apply to combats and assaults. We're ignoring the blue text because I'm not going to be playing with the optional rules. Then there's a modifier for assaults only. Some special notes concerning night turns and the hotel hex appears a special case. When defending with an infantry or machine gun unit in the hotel hex, you can ignore the first loss, I think, as the defender. So suppressed results from ranged support here provide a 1-column shift in your favor to a maximum of 3 in either direction. And then over here on the ranged attack table, there are also certain modifiers. Depending on the number of infantry companies in the target hex, if the target hex is a frozen lake, if the firing mortars or infantry guns are self-spotting, if the spotter is non-adjacent to the target, if the target is dug in, if it's a night turn, if there's fog, if it's dawn or dusk, if it's a machine gun unit that's firing from 3 or more hexes away, etc. Alright, so here is my quick line of sight segment. Let's say, for example, this were the case, and we were in a day turn, so line of sight is 5, hexes. Line of sight in this game can pass through frozen lake hexes and into adjacent hexes. So in this case, this Soviet machine gun unit would be able to see this Finnish infantry company that's 3 hexes away, because we have nothing but frozen lake hexes in between. Its range is 3, and it has a ranged attack of 5. It would be able to conduct direct fire into that hex by rolling on the ranged attack table. Let's say this were the case and there was a friendly unit intervening. This machine gun unit would still be able to see that infantry company, but would no longer be able to directly fire upon it. Let's say, however, that this were the case. This infantry gun would be able to use this infantry company as its spotter to fire indirectly upon that unit. Now, let's say that this were the case, and it's still a day turn. These Finnish mortars would be able to see this infantry company. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 4 hexes away. However, if we move this 1 hex over, they can no longer see that unit, even though it's within 5 hexes, because there is non-frozen lake hex on both sides of the hex spine along the line of sight, even though they're at differing points here and here. Here's a look at the back of the player aid. A lot of these tables we'll probably not even use, but there's an anti-tank fire table, and then these 2 tables that we use during night turns, Sub-Zero Loss table and Finnish Night Raid table. We saw the recovery table before, and then a bunch of these optional rules tables that we will not use. Just wanted to show you, including captured Soviet light machine guns, getting lost in the woods, and Hayari's heart condition. Alright, so here's a look at my setup. We have Finnish units in white, Soviet units in brown. The Finnish units are basically as far east as they'll go. North is in this direction, which places them right up against Lake Tolvajärvi, kind of skirting the western shore, making it halfway across Hiivasalmi Bridge. Down here there are 4 dug-in hexes in the village of Tolvajärvi, and they've made it as far south as this little island here, Valasari. There's also a stack back in Luutikamoki, and some units here along the northern coast of this smaller lake. So specifically we have an infantry company and machine gun unit in each of these 2 hexes, mortars back here on the secondary road. In the 4 dug-in village hexes, 3 of them contain 2 infantry companies. Here we have an infantry company and machine gun unit, and right behind them another mortar unit, also in the village. On the bridge, which is also dug in, we have an infantry company and machine gun unit. Across from them, on this coast, we have an engineer platoon, infantry company, and machine gun unit. There's some units here on these secondary roads. Back here, an infantry company and mortars. Over here, an infantry company and machine gun unit. And in Luutikamoki, which is also dug in, we have Pajari, 3 reduced strength bicycle companies, and a reduced strength machine gun unit. The Soviets have made their way up the main road, and we've kind of scattered some AT units back here in the southern portion. They've taken Kivisalmi Bridge, they've made it across Tolvajärvi, they've taken Kotasari and Okolansari, and they've taken the hotel as well as the gravel pits, and are making their way across Hiivasalmi Bridge. On this side they've also taken Hirvasvaara. So over here we have 3 full-strength infantry companies. Just ahead of them, an infantry company and machine gun unit. In each of these dug-in Kotasari hexes is a full, we have a battalion in each of these units. One of the infantry companies in this hex here is reduced. And then on Okolansari we have another AT unit and 3 infantry companies. Up here on Hiivasalmi Bridge is an infantry company and a machine gun unit. there's also one of each in this dug-in gravel pits hex. And this hotel hex, also dug in, is a full-strength and reduced-strength infantry company, infantry guns, and 2 mortar units. Another unit of infantry guns adjacent to the hotel, and then next to it, machine guns. And Hirvasvara is a full-strength battalion consisting of 3 infantry companies and a machine gun unit. Just south of it is this lone infantry company right along the coast of Hirvasjärvi. Last but not least, let us take a look at the special rules and victory conditions for the scenario. The Finnish player may declare a change of operational stance at the conclusion of any Finnish turn beginning on day 4, turn 20, or turn 8 in our playthrough. They start out as the second player, as is often the case in this game, but then once they declare a change of operational stance, they become player 1, which means they get a back-to-back turn, and they gain a morale bonus for the rest of the game, which grants them 1 column shift in their favor during combats, 2 column shift in their favor during assaults, and a +1 die roll modifier during recovery rolls, much like the day 1 Soviet morale bonus. The rules for Soviet morale collapse are in effect. That usually starts on day 4 and has a number of irreversible effects for the remainder of the game, including the fact that they cannot perform a combat or result if they're demoralized. They cannot perform recovery, cannot enter an enemy zone of control during their action phase, and it grants the Finns an additional 1 right column shift in combats and assaults against such units. Also, it states here, any dug-in markers not placed at the start of the scenario, which are at this point 4 Finnish dug-in markers limited by the counter mix. Those are available to the Finnish player for use during the rest of the scenario. The Finns are not eligible for the first night raid of the game die roll modifier, which is a +2 die roll modifier on the Finnish night raid table, which makes sense since we're already on day 3. And then finally, the Finnish provisional company, this variable reinforcement, has not yet been created, but may be during the scenario, as long as certain conditions are met. And I think those are when a Soviet unit or units has entered hex column I or west of it, and if Pajari is within 4 hexes of Luutikamoki, I believe. Victory conditions are a lot like those seen in other scenarios in the campaign game as well. You're granted victory points based on what objectives you control, reduced if those are out of supply but still controlled. The first 7 hexes of the main road, Kivisalmi Bridge, Kodasari Island, all hexes or any hex. Hirvasvara, the hotel, the gravel pits, Hiivasalmi Bridge, per hex or for both hexes, Tolvajärvi, worth more to the Soviet player, Luutikamoki, and the Finnish supply source hex. Then there's this Finnish artillery park event that we'll get to if we get to it. And then there's an automatic victory condition that ends the game immediately if a player controls, and at the instant he controls every hex of the main road from the Soviet supply source to the Finnish supply source hex. If neither player achieves this victory condition, the rest of the scenario is played and scores are tallied. You also get points based on enemy losses. So that is my intro, and I'll get started on the playthrough here shortly. Thanks for watching.